Imagine waking up in the dead of night. You haven't been roused by the sound of breaking glass or heavy footsteps, but by a suffocating, crushing weight on your chest. You try to scream, but you can't. Your mouth is packed full of something wet, gritty, and foul-tasting. You are choking on mud and earth. As your eyes adjust to the gloom, you see a figure looming over you in the darkness. But this isn't a demon trying to tear you apart. It is a broken, blinded mother, and she is trying to feed you. Welcome back to Jekyll's Journal. Tonight, we are stepping away from the familiar urban legends of the West and plunging into the deep, humid darkness of Southeast Asia. We are looking into a phantom that is not entirely unique to one country, as variations of this entity exist across the region. However, in Vietnam, this spirit is known by a name that sends shivers down the spines of those who know the law: the Ma Vu Dai. It refers to a ghost with unnaturally long breasts. If you are expecting a traditional tale of a vengeful spirit wielding a knife, you are in the wrong place. The horror of the Ma Vu Dai is entirely different. It is a horror born of profound tragedy, twisted by dark magic, and driven by a maternal instinct so powerful it shattered the boundary between life and death. Turn off your lights, put on your headphones. Let's open the journal. To understand the creeping dread associated with this entity, we have to look at how it operates in the shadows. We won't start with the origin, we will start with the aftermath. In the 1960s, within the dense, sweltering confines of Saigon, rumors began to circulate among the prison populations. Prisons during this era were places of extreme isolation, despair, and violence. But the inmates weren't whispering about abusive guards or terrible conditions. They were whispering about the night. Prisoners, locked in their cramped, dimly lit cells, reported waking up to an impossible, terrifying sight. In the absolute dead of night, when the rest of the cell block was silent, a woman would appear. The descriptions were always identical, and they were always horrifying. She possessed unnaturally long breasts, and she would descend upon the terrified, paralyzed victims. The inmates reported that this apparition would physically attack them, pinning them down in the dark. She wasn't trying to kill them in any conventional sense. Instead, she would force-feed them. The sheer terror of the violation, combined with the suffocating lack of oxygen, would cause the helpless victims to fall completely unconscious. When morning came, the men would wake up gasping, their mouths tasting of rot and earth, questioning their own sanity. Why would a spirit target grown men in a prison? What twisted maternal instinct drives an entity to force-feed strangers until they pass out? To answer that, we have to travel further back in time, to a wealthy estate in the provinces, and uncover one of the most heartbreaking and gruesome origins in supernatural folklore. Decades ago, long before the city expanded, there lived a wealthy family who were as affluent as they were deeply, inherently cruel. They were known throughout the region for their ruthless nature, stepping on anyone who got in their way. But despite all their money and power, they faced a singular, infuriating problem. The family had an older son, a man who was already over 40 years old. He had taken 8 different wives over the years, yet he remained childless. He could not produce a male heir to carry on the family name and inherit their vast fortune. Desperate and impatient, the matriarch of the family decided to take matters into her own hands. She didn't seek medical help, she sought the esoteric. She traveled to a neighboring province to consult a highly revered Feng Shui master, a man known for his dark and effective methods. The master gave her a chillingly specific set of instructions. He told her that she must venture out on the night of the full moon. He described exactly what kind of woman she needed to find to bear her son a child. When the full moon rose, illuminating the rice paddies in a pale, ghostly light, the wealthy woman and her servants set out into the night. They found exactly who the master had described, a poor, destitute girl out in the mud, catching snails to survive.
Without hesitation, the servants ambushed the girl, kidnapping her and dragging her back to the sprawling estate. When the son saw her, he was disgusted. She was poor, covered in the mud of the fields, and wore ragged clothing. He refused to touch her. But his mother, driven by a fanatical desire for an heir, forced the issue. The servants stripped the girl, bathed her against her will, and dragged her into the son's room. They tied her down, holding her arms and legs, forcing her to endure unimaginable abuse. This nightmare repeated night after night. When the horrific ordeal was over, they would lock her in a cramped, dark woodshed, chaining her like an animal. She begged the servants to let her go, weeping and promising to disappear, but they were too terrified of the matriarch's wrath to intervene. Eventually, the inevitable happened. The local healer confirmed that the captive girl was pregnant. For 9 months, she lived in absolute misery, chained in the dark. The only thing that kept her tethered to her sanity was the tiny flutter of life growing inside her. She endured the torment purely for the sake of her unborn child. When the time finally came, she gave birth in agonizing pain, her screams echoing through the cold estate. The moment the child was born, she heard its first fragile cry. She smiled, her heart swelling with a desperate mother's love. And then, exhausted and broken, she passed out. When she finally opened her eyes, the world was wrong. She wasn't in the estate. She was lying in the dirt, abandoned by the side of a river. Her child was gone. Agony ripped through her body, but it was nothing compared to the psychological torment of losing her baby. Her breasts were swollen, heavy, and painfully engorged with milk. Driven to the brink of total madness by grief and physical pain, she began to drag herself across the countryside. She asked anyone she saw if they had seen her baby, but her ragged appearance and frantic demeanor made people turn away. As night fell, she recognized the landscape. She had crawled all the way back to the estate where she had been tortured. From the outside, she heard the sound that would shatter her heart, the distinct, desperate crying of an infant. She pounded on the heavy wooden doors, screaming for them to let her feed her child, but the servants chased her away, beating her into the darkness. Unable to reach the doors, she dragged her battered body toward the back of the property. There, looming near the window of the room where her baby cried, stood a tall xoan tree. With her last remaining ounces of strength, her body screaming in protest, she began to climb. She pulled herself higher and higher into the branches, her eyes fixed on the illuminated window. Through the glass, she saw the matriarch holding her crying baby. Overwhelmed by instinct, the mother leaned forward, reaching out her arms, crying out to her child. In her desperation, she lost her footing. She plummeted from the high branches. She struck the hard earth below with a sickening, wet crunch. Her neck snapped instantly. Her limbs were broken and bent at impossible, horrifying angles. As she lay there, dying in the dirt, the milk meant for her child leaked from her body, mixing with her own blood.
The servants found her twisted corpse the next morning.
Terrified of a scandal, the family hastily wrapped her broken body in a woven mat and buried her directly beneath the very tree she had fallen from. They thought the nightmare was over. They were wrong. A few nights later, the rumors began. Servants whispered that a woman with long hair and a broken, violently twisted neck was standing outside the baby's window. They said she would reach through the bars, her breasts dragging against the sill, to nurse the crying child. The matriarch, terrified, stayed up one night to see it for herself. Sure enough, in the pale moonlight, she saw the ghost of the girl. The entity's neck was snapped, her head lolling sickeningly to the side as she hummed a raspy lullaby, offering her breast to the infant. Panicked, the matriarch fled back to the dark Feng Shui master. She begged him for a way to stop the ghost. The master's solution was as vile as the family's original crime. He told the family they had to dig up the rotting corpse. They must take a blade and slice the thick, calloused skin from the soles of the dead woman's feet. Then they had to take a needle and thread and physically sew that thick skin directly over the dead woman's eyes, blinding her spirit for eternity. Finally, they were to take the child and flee the province. The family followed the grotesque instructions perfectly. When they were done, they packed their wealth and vanished, leaving the blinded, mutilated spirit behind. And so, the Ma Vu Dai was truly born. A spirit not of pure malice, but of infinite, agonizing maternal grief. She wanders the earth, her neck still broken, her eyes sewn shut with the skin of her own feet, unable to see. She navigates the darkness by sound alone. Whenever she hears the sound of a child crying, her tragic delusion takes over. She believes it is her lost baby, and she will do anything to comfort it. This brings us to a story submitted to the channel by a father who lived in an old, drafty house near the provinces. It perfectly illustrates how this entity operates today. This father had two young daughters. The older sister was 7 years old, and the younger sister was just 5. One humid afternoon, the mother had to step out briefly to gather rice, leaving the 7-year-old in charge of watching her 5-year-old sister. The mother left strict instructions to keep the younger girl on a mat in the center of the room. Shortly after the mother left, the 5-year-old began to cry. It wasn't just a whimper. It was a loud, sustained wail. The 7-year-old panicked. Remembering her mother's advice, she ran into the back bedroom to find a piece of her mother's clothing, hoping the familiar scent would calm her sister down. As she rummaged through the dark bedroom, she suddenly realized the house had gone dead silent. The crying had stopped. Relieved, the 7-year-old heard a soft, rhythmic humming. It sounded like her mother singing a lullaby. Assuming her mother had returned early, the young girl ran out of the bedroom, calling out to her. But when she reached the main room, the front door was still tightly shut and padlocked from the outside. Her mother wasn't there. She turned her attention to her 5-year-old sister, who was now standing on the bed, pushed right up against the iron bars of the open window. The little girl had her face pressed toward the outside, completely silent. The 7-year-old walked closer, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Standing on the other side of the window bars was a woman. Her skin was a sickly, dark grey, the color of a bruised corpse. She wore a brown, temple-style shirt, but the buttons were completely undone. Hanging from her chest were two impossibly long, pendulous breasts that drooped all the way down to her navel. The woman's long, filthy hair obscured most of her face, but the most horrifying detail was her posture. Her neck was broken. Her head hung limply, resting almost entirely on her shoulder. Every 2 or 3 seconds, the woman would raise a pale, dirt-caked hand to physically push her head back upright onto her neck. As soon as she let go, the head would sickeningly flop back down. Through the bars, the woman was softly stroking the 5-year-old's hair with long, mud-caked fingernails. The entity had taken one of her long breasts and pushed it through the iron bars, and the mesmerized 5-year-old was quietly nursing. As the ghost sang her soft, raspy lullaby, her lips parted, revealing a mouth full of black, sharp teeth that looked like a jagged saw blade. The 7-year-old screamed in absolute terror. The ghost stopped singing. She pushed her head upright again and turned toward the older sister. Because her eyes were sewn shut beneath her hair, she had a completely blank, terrifying upper face. The ghost raised a finger to her black lips, shushing the screaming 7-year-old. Then, she reached into the pocket of her brown shirt. She held out her hand through the bars. Resting in her pale palm were brightly colored candies. "Are you hungry?" the ghost rasped. "Here, have some candy." The 7-year-old didn't want to step forward, but there was a strange, hypnotic pull to the entity's voice. As the girl watched, the candy in the ghost's hand seemed to multiply, overflowing from her palm and spilling onto the bedsheets. Unable to resist the supernatural compulsion, the 7-year-old climbed onto the bed, grabbed handfuls of the brightly colored sweets, and began frantically stuffing them into her mouth, chewing and swallowing. Suddenly, the sound of the padlock rattling at the front door shattered the silence. The mother had returned, calling out for her girls. The ghost froze. She quickly pulled her breast back through the iron bars. The 7-year-old watched in horror as the entity dropped to the ground outside. But she didn't crawl away like a normal person. The ghost arched her back until she was bent entirely backward, her belly and long breasts facing up toward the sky. With her broken neck lolling in the dirt, she began to rapidly crawl backward on all fours, like a twisted, inverted spider, dragging her long breasts through the mud and leaves until she disappeared into the thick brush. The mother burst into the room. She found the 5-year-old crying hysterically, but her true horror was reserved for her older daughter. The mother screamed. The 7-year-old snapped out of her trance and looked down at her hands. They were covered in thick, black mud. She tasted copper and filth in her mouth. She gagged and vomited all over the bed. She hadn't been eating brightly colored candy. The entity had tricked her. The 7-year-old threw up massive clumps of wet earth, sand, and writhing earthworms. When the family consulted the village elders, they were told they were incredibly lucky. The Ma Vu Dai is a tragic figure, but her presence is a profound violation of the natural order. Because her eyes are sewn shut, she wanders blindly, guided only by the sound of weeping children. If your child cries in the night, she will hear it. She will come to the window, and she will force her rotting, spectral milk upon them, trying to fill a void that can never be closed. It's a chilling reminder that not all monsters are born from hatred. Sometimes the most terrifying entities are born from a love so deep
and a grief so profound that it refuses to stay buried in the earth. Thank you for joining me here in Jekyll's journal. If this story kept you awake, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Have you ever heard a lullaby when you were completely alone in the house? Until next time, keep the windows locked.